Hello everyone, Poohhead189 here, and today we're going to be talking about a few topics that connect to the current discourse in the D&D world, and in some ways the fantasy genre in general. A large part of the video is going to be about orcs. In fact, it's going to be probably the meat of the video, but sometimes I'll pull in some mention of dark elves and dwarves as well, and who knows what else. Anyway, we all agree that a huge influence on the modern fantasy genre is Tolkien, and so even though the current scene in D&D drove this conversation, Tolkien is where we'll begin, asking the question on whether or not he himself was racist, followed by the topic on whether or not there were racist aspects of his work, and whether or not any racist aspects were transferred to D&D. Now, before we begin, some information on myself. I am an author, a scholar of history, and I've been a fanatic of both Tolkien and D&D for close to 20 years, focusing my attention and time mostly on the lore in both cases. I'm telling you this so you don't think that I read an article or two and decided to make a video. Speaking of articles, and this will come up in some of my later videos, articles are generally not a good source for a discussion. At least journalistic articles. An article is an argument, and an argument is used when someone has already made up their mind on a conclusion. An article is not information. Let me repeat that. An article is an argument, not information. So, as a historian myself, if I saw an article that said Alexander the Great had autism, that does not mean that there has been an unbiased and uncontested discovery about the nature of Alexander the Great's brain function. That simply means the person who wrote the article believes this. Yes, they might have information, but the article is not the information, and oftentimes articles use snippets of information to make their argument seem true when it might not be. It's the same thing with people on Twitter saying that Tolkien was racist. They might provide little snippets of information. Well, we'll get into it. Anyway, when I speak on topics on my videos, I usually explain and then give the answer to the discussion afterwards. But I'll give spoilers on this first question. I, and pretty much everyone else on Earth, knows Tolkien was not himself racist. In fact, it's clear he was an avid anti-racist, which is a strange term to me, because if you're not racist, then you tend to be anti-racist anyway, because the reason you aren't racist is that you understand the very ideology is abhorrent. So let's just say Tolkien was outspoken in his stance against the ideology of racism. It's public knowledge at this point that Tolkien famously reprimanded the Nazis back in the day, discussed it at their race doctrine as wholly pernicious and unscientific. He was considering not having any ties to Germany at all anymore, when it came to publishing his works. What had occurred was that Tolkien had a German publisher at the time, and the Nazis were getting suspicious of any authors that weren't residing in Germany at the moment. So when asked in a letter if Tolkien was Jewish or followed the Nazi line of thinking, Tolkien sent two letters. One that sidestepped the question, as he wanted to spare his publishing company from a scandal because he actually knew and were friends with people from the publishing company, and one where he sent his true feelings on the matter. Obviously, the publishing company sent the one that didn't show his true feelings, but it was kept unedited and has been recorded to be read today in the volume of Tolkien's Letters. In it, he talks thoroughly on European ethnicities, criticizing the Nazis for being hypocrites, and he even told them how he wished he could claim as lofty as an ancestry as those of the Jews, which of course takes away any credibility of any anti-Semitic accusations people throw Tolkien's way when it comes to the dwarves, but we'll discuss that more later on. Okay, let's get through the basics first. People tend to say because many things in Tolkien's works that are good are called light and fair, and many things are evil are called dark and black, that it is a clear sign of racism. I cannot believe I am actually explaining this to adults. Light has been considered good and dark has been considered malevolent since human civilization began, and the first instances are in ancient Mesopotamia, with brown people. We all know that the ancient Iranians were huge white supremacists. The prevailing theory is based on human eyesight and the human psyche. Humans' main fear since time immemorial has been things that they don't understand, and the thing that has brought what humans cannot understand the most is nighttime and darkness, because you cannot see. It's that simple. That's why every kid in existence since the Stone Age is afraid of the dark. It's not like every kid is collectively racist. Even the black kids. They're afraid of the dark. Why would they? Sorry. Not because racism, but because things unknown might lurk in the darkness. That's why people are afraid of space or the deep ocean. That's why monsters such as vampires can only come out at night. That's why Star Wars uses the light side and the dark side. It has nothing to do with white or black people, but everything to do with human evolution and what we consider benevolent and malevolent. That's why Sauron is the Dark Lord, just like Voldemort, who uses dark sorcery with dark minions. It's why orcs can't fight in the sunlight and trolls turn to stone. It's this basic concept that is infused into our very beings as mankind, and somehow people looked at it and called it racist. It's mind-boggling. Following this, there is the claim that the good men like the Rohirrim and the Gondorians were light-skinned, and their enemies were people of color. This is both an oversimplification and also inherently wrong. Let's start with how Tolkien formed his world. At first, and he changes this later, but it still affected his prose, Tolkien wanted to write an English fairy tale that England itself could be proud of. Tolkien's main fields of study were Norse and Old English tales, and they were his main inspirations for his work. He even wrote in letter 294 that he dislikes using any racial terms when it comes to his studies, and that he had a certain fondness for the civilization of the Northwest Europe, as he and his ancestors have lived there for many years. A fondness for his home like every man should, as he put it. However, while his ancestors certainly grew up there and he lived there as he wrote the letter, Tolkien was actually born in South Africa to a middle-class family, but we'll discuss that more later. For now, let's talk about Tolkien's choice to make the majority of his Lord of the Rings tale in the northwestern section of Middle-earth. This means a few things. Firstly, it means we see very little of the South and the East. We don't know what they're like, for good or for bad. The only people we see there are the attackers, which means that there could potentially be whole cities or kingdoms who weren't on the quote-unquote evil side. And these so-called evil men are given multiple instances of humanization, such as when Sam, though in the movie it was Faramir, who wondered about the dead Southron. I'll quote with, "He wondered what the man's name was and where he came from, and if he was really evil at heart, and what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace." In fact, the race of man was born in the East, and only a few moved ever westward. It was only by learning from the Elves that the men who went west became knowledgeable in the Valar and the Light of Aman, not their inherent goodness or anything to do with skin color. And the reason the men of the East and the South were enemies of the Western men wasn't because they were inherently evil either. In fact, if you read through the Silmarillion, the people had grudges against one another over the course of thousands of years. The enmity between the Easterlings and Gondorians are cultural grudges, and Morgoth and Sauron don't recruit Easterlings because of their evil nature, but because they know the Easterlings think of the Gondorians as the enemy, not the other way around. And when that doesn't work, they use fear to sway them. Just as Saruman used grudges and fear for the wild men of Dunland to fight the men of Rohan, Dunlandings reputedly being a stand-in for the native Celts, while the Rohirrim who took some of their land are obviously based off the Anglo-Saxons, two white ethnicities. So there was no inherent evil in any of these men. They simply held grudges, were tricked, or forced through fear to fight the northern men. Also, black Númenóreans, who were actually white-skinned, they're just called black because evil, as I explained earlier with the Mesopotamians, they were loyal to Sauron after the fall of Númenor, and then they made their bases south of Gondor around Umbar and Harad, which is how the local men were influenced to hate the Northmen. So in a way, you could argue that in Tolkien's Legendarium, it was the light-skinned Númenóreans that tricked and influenced the darker-skinned people to join the forces of darkness. So if you actually read Tolkien's work, it was the white people's fault. Also, let's not forget that in Northwest Middle-earth, there were darker-skinned people. Certain hobbits, along with the men of Bree, were called swarthy-skinned, just like the orcs and the Easterlings. Not only that, but there are no shortage of light-skinned people who were either evil or committed evil acts in his works. Saruman, Grima Wormtongue, Gollum, Boromir, Denethor, Thorin, the Master of Lake Town, the Black Númenóreans, the list goes on. But we're not even here to speak about men. This entire discussion began because we were speaking about orcs and dark elves. Well, since no drow exist in Tolkien's works, and the only dark elves there are simply elves who lived in dark places and didn't see the light of Valinor, we'll go with the orcs. And this leads us to our two biggest and arguably most, quote-unquote, convincing arguments of racism. Orcs. Now, looking past the fact that orcs are swarthy-skinned, because I already discussed there are good people who also were, we'll look at the go-to of those who cry racism. And these are the two things. This has to do with the letter 210 of Tolkien's letters, and it honestly makes me laugh. It makes me laugh because out of nearly 400 pages filled with private letters written by Tolkien himself, many of which showcase how he dislikes racial terminology, they find this single line that could perhaps be construed as problematic, and they hold on to it so ferociously, as like a lifeline, as if the Titanic is sinking and it's their only salvation. In letter 210, Tolkien is speaking to an American agent for a filmmaker after having read the script for an adaptation of his books. Tolkien thinks the script is terrible and apologizes at the start if he sounds aggravated, and he mentions a number of things. One out of the many is that the orcs, who in Zimmerman's script, Zimmerman was the filmmaker, were beaked and feathered. Tolkien says this is entirely wrong. He said the orcs are, quoting, squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the to Europeans least lovely Mongol types. That's it. He's talking to an American about how orcs would look to biased Europeans. He actually put in there, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. He never mentions that's how he got the idea for orcs. He never mentioned that's how real Mongolians or non-Europeans looked. He even mentioned the European bias and that orcs looked uglier than the bias. Essentially, if Zimmerman wanted to make orcs on the big screen, he needed to make them uglier and more repulsive than how European propaganda, newspaper comics, paint Eastern communists who they were currently fighting a Cold War against. Oh yeah, and people also mention how Uruk-hai were black-skinned, but, if you knew anything about the lore, is that they were orcs that could walk under the sun but it still charred their skin, like an open flame. I forgot how things burn are racist. I'll tell my burgers that next time I grill. Anyway, there's another passage that I felt had the most ground to stand on when it came to a racist claim. In fact, I'm not sure why more people haven't mentioned this, because if they hadn't done the research, you could certainly claim it's somewhat problematic. At the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Tolkien describes men attacking out of Far Harad, and Harad is the southern country, or continent actually. Black men like half-trolls with white eyes and red tongues. So apparently he's talking about black people who look like half-trolls, although later on in the chapter he calls them troll men, which could mean they aren't actually fully human, and we know from the Uruk-hai that the enemy does crossbreed. But let's pretend they are fully human. Obviously, the insult there is that they are like half-trolls, though that can mean a lot of things. It can mean that they are strong or fierce, but it could also mean they are ugly and stupid. We don't know. We do know that the dark-skinned Haradrim were called normal men, and these men from Far Harad were their cousins and neighbors. So why would Tolkien differentiate two dark-skinned, closely related people? Why would he make it seem like these two dark-skinned people are so different? He likely did it because Far Harad was inhabited by big men who were fierce in battle. And who knows, maybe they were more primitive than other peoples. Or maybe they were actually crossbred with trolls. We don't know. Tolkien wrote 14 books, and we're looking at one line in one book. Also to note, he called certain groups of white people repulsive unequivocally, like the Druidane, unlike the Haradrim whom people think Tolkien might maybe have in certain way that you can construe his words. Now, there are multiple letters in Tolkien's Letters, which I'm actually holding right now, whom he sent to family and close friends about how he hates apartheid and segregation, and as I mentioned earlier, he was born in South Africa. His father died when he was very young, and his mother was his main influence. And although she did die when he was 12 and he had to go into foster care, but before then, she was a big influence on his life. And she was known to preach against segregation to him. Not only that, but they had a few workers and maids at their house, some white and some black. Wouldn't it be odd if Tolkien thought less of black people when his first friends were black and his family was so close to the black family that worked for them that they were in the family pictures for Christmas cards, rather than the white people that worked for them? Don't you think people think too much into this stuff and look past the actual mountains of evidence that shows Tolkien was not only not racist, but avidly anti-racist? Out of all the letters that he sent, preaching against it, saying how it was an abomination? I can't believe I even have to make this video. I'm sorry, I keep digressing. So if Tolkien's works and the man himself aren't racist, then the races that came from his works and influenced D&D weren't racist, at least at their inception. Now, I'm always transparent, so I'm going to tell you something else. It is claimed, and I don't know the validity of this, so take it with a grain of salt, but it is claimed that back in the 60s, The original creators of Dungeons & Dragons made models of orcs and other monstrous creatures by repainting older models of Native Americans. Now, I don't know if this is true. It's probably not, but hey, it could be. Although let me tell you, as a Native American myself, of the Seminole tribe, I'm not going to take this instance of them using whatever models they had at hand, models they didn't make themselves, to repaint and look more monstrous. That doesn't bring a legacy to D&D, the same way that if I or some of you have lied once or twice before, doesn't make you liars. A liar is someone who is deceitful often, not someone who hasn't done it but for a few occasions in their life. If you think otherwise, you are utterly insane and need professional help. To top it off, let's speak on two peoples before we go. Firstly, dwarves. People tend to think dwarves are a negative stereotype to the Jews. Well, I already spoke about how Tolkien spoke very highly of the Jews and mocked the Nazis for their racism of them, but people still have had thoughts that Tolkien was racist towards them for no real reason. You all know I'm a huge dwarf fan. I got a bunch of videos on dwarves. And in fact, I've read multiple articles about this subject over the years, meaning dwarves being connected to Jews in Tolkien's works. Not for the info, as I said, but to see how people would argue it. They had nothing of any real substance to say other than the vague notion of this is problematic because dwarves are known to be greedy. Unfortunately for these people, dwarves have been greedy for over 3,000 years in real time, because they were greedy in the Norse mythology that they were based on. Now, Tolkien did twice compare the dwarves to Jews, but only on language, and on the fact that they had their homes taken from them, unjustly I might add. And last but not least, Dark Elves. Now, this has nothing really to do with Tolkien, but this does have something to do with D&D. Another people whose origins are from Norse mythology, and if you're interested in Norse mythology, I made a 30-minute video a few years ago on that very subject in a 4-part video series on Viking culture. I suggest you go look at it. Anyway, Dark Elves are theorized to be synonymous with Norse dwarves, and there's also an old Scots word called trow that means, in folklore, one of a race of underground elves represented as skillful workers in metal, compared to troll. And as everyone knows, trow sounds a lot like drow from Forgotten Realms, doesn't it? In the Prose Edda, the Dark Elves are described as living underground, are dark as pitch, which is completely black, and it also describes black elves who smith magical artifacts with expert craft. None of these allude to black people or darker-skinned peoples in the real world. It's the same dichotomy of black and white that still exists in human civilization for thousands upon thousands of years. This is what influenced Gary Gygax. Not anything to do with race. Dark Elves are evil. They're great villains. Some can even be cool renegade good guys like Drizzt Do'Urden. Like, everyone who follows this channel knows that I was on the Dungeon Cast because I'm such a big fan of D&D, and you know that I talked to them about Drizzt before they got R.A. Salvatore on there. So I know Dark Elves' worth. Anyway, I keep going off tangent. To conclude, Tolkien nor mainstream Western fantasy is racist. There are monsters, such as orcs, that heroes in a fictional story or game can slay without having to apologize to a sensitivity consultant. People shouldn't have to apologize for them wanting orcs to be evil, or for keeping orcs the way they are, or for keeping drow the way they are, because these two races are based on folklore and not racism. So, just like with any fictional monster, cyclops, giants, you can slay them no problem. Just because people on Twitter think that they are an analogy for black people, which you have to be racist to think in the first place. And just because they cling to like 2 lines of Tolkien's works in the 14 books that he wrote, that they think that Tolkien was racist, with pretty much no proof. In fact, there is no definitive proof, as I already discussed. Yeah, it's just mind-boggling. If you guys can, share this video. If you enjoyed it, like, comment. I'd love to hear your comments. Subscriptions always help the channel. And yeah, thank you very much, and have a lovely day.